I want to be clear from the beginning that I am not someone who believes easily in strange explanations, and I am definitely not the kind of person who looks for meaning in shadows or patterns where none exist, because my job as a long-haul truck driver depends on staying calm, alert, and grounded in reality, especially when I am alone on the road for hours at a time. On the night this happened, I was already exhausted before I even started driving, because the delivery schedule had been pushed back multiple times, and by the time I finally left the depot, it was well past midnight, with the kind of silence outside that makes even familiar highways feel unfamiliar. The truck I was assigned that night was older, but it had been retrofitted with modern safety equipment, including a fully functional front dash cam, a rear camera, and side monitoring systems, all of which I personally checked before leaving, because I do not like surprises when I am driving through isolated areas. About an hour into the drive, my navigation system suggested a shortcut through a mountain forest highway, and although I normally avoid those routes at night, I decided to take it because I was already late and the system showed no warnings, closures, or hazards. At first, the road felt normal, even peaceful, with tall trees lining both sides and my headlights carving a narrow tunnel of visibility through the darkness, while the sound of the engine and tires became the only reminders that I was still moving forward. It was roughly 20 minutes into this forest road when I noticed a figure standing on the right side of the highway, far enough from the lane to not pose immediate danger, but close enough that the beam of my headlights briefly illuminated what looked like a tall person wearing a long, dark outer garment that blended unnaturally well with the surrounding trees. I did not slow down, and I did not stop, because seeing people on remote roads is unusual but not unheard of, and at that moment I assumed it was either a local resident, a stranded traveler, or someone who had made a poor decision about walking at night. What unsettled me later was not the sight itself, but how easily my mind accepted it and then immediately tried to forget it, as if it were something insignificant, even though a quiet discomfort lingered in the background of my thoughts. Several miles later, as the road curved deeper into the forest, I saw the same figure again, standing in nearly the same position relative to the road, with the same posture and the same dark clothing, and this time my brain hesitated, struggling to explain how that was possible without me having turned around or slowed down significantly. I told myself it must be a coincidence because the alternative explanation required accepting something I was not prepared to consider, especially in the middle of the night on an isolated mountain road. When I passed the figure a third time, however, the sense of unease intensified because the distance between the sightings made no logical sense, and the figure appeared unchanged, as if time or movement had not affected it at all. At that point, I finally glanced at the dashcam monitor, expecting to see the person captured clearly, since the camera angle covered exactly the area I had just driven through, but the screen showed nothing except an empty stretch of road disappearing into darkness.
I checked the rear camera as well, and once again there was no sign of anyone walking, standing, or moving behind the truck, which should have been impossible given how clearly I had seen the figure with my own eyes. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself that fatigue can cause visual misinterpretations, especially when the environment lacks detail and contrast, but the feeling of being watched did not fade, and instead seemed to grow stronger with every passing minute. Not long after that, I noticed movement in my left side mirror, and at first I assumed it was an animal running parallel to the truck, something common in forested areas, until I realized that the movement was too consistent and too fast to be explained that way. When I focused more closely, I recognized the outline of the same figure, now running alongside the truck at a speed that should not have been physically possible, given that I was traveling well above highway limits. What disturbed me most was not the speed itself, but the way the figure moved, because there was no visible strain, no irregular motion, and no sign of fatigue, as if the act of running required no effort at all. My heart began to race as I checked the side camera, expecting confirmation that what I was seeing was real, but once again the screen showed nothing except the side of the truck and the blurred edge of the road. Even as my fear increased, I forced myself to keep driving steadily, because stopping on a narrow forest road in the middle of the night felt far more dangerous than continuing forward. When I looked back at the side mirror moments later, the figure was gone, and instead of relief, I felt a sudden wave of dread, because whatever explanation my mind had been clinging to no longer applied. Shortly after that, I experienced the most terrifying moment of the entire drive when I saw what appeared to be the same figure standing directly ahead in my lane, forcing me to brake hard and bring the truck to a sudden stop. The headlights illuminated the empty road, and there was no one there, yet my hands were shaking so badly that I had to grip the steering wheel just to stay grounded. I stayed in that spot for several seconds, listening to my own breathing, checking every camera feed repeatedly, hoping to find something that would confirm I was imagining things, but the footage remained clean and uninterrupted. When I finally continued driving, I did not slow down again until I reached a populated area, and by the time the sun began to rise, the forest no longer felt threatening, even though the memory of the night refused to fade. Nothing like that has happened to me since, and I still drive trucks for a living, but even now I find myself checking mirrors, windows, and reflections more often than necessary, because once you experience something you cannot explain, part of you never fully trusts the dark again.